Hey everybody, it's the Professor, and once again, it's the one and only Blue Pill Professor, coming at you from the internet and talking to you about the things we really care about, namely, the nature of women, and what we are all going to do about it now that we have awoken from our long slumber.
Been dazed and confused for so long, it's not true. Wanted a woman, never bargained for you. Lots of people talking, few of them know. Soul of a woman was created below.
And today, on the question of whether a woman's soul was truly created below, we turn to a well-characterized and very specific characteristic about women and also about men, which I believe provides evidence that a woman's soul was indeed created below. And this will be the first part of a multi-part series on the specific characteristics of women which certainly give the impression that her soul was created below. And I'm talking about, this week, the female in-group preference. Let me repeat that. Female in-group preference. And what that means is that women favor women. Men also favor women. And so when women demand to fight on an equal playing field, knowing that women favor women reflexively and men favor women reflexively, that's not really an equal playing field then, now is it? So I have a couple pieces of evidence of this female in-group preference. And for an analysis and an understanding of the actual consequences of this preference, we turn to that night in December 1912 on Her Majesty's ship HMS Titanic, heading at maximum speed from London to New York across the icy, iceberg-filled waters of the North Atlantic, which, as most of us remember, struck an iceberg and sank into the frigid waters with 2,223 souls aboard, of which just 706 survived and 1,517 drowned or froze to death in the frigid waters. But when we look at the breakdown of the dead and surviving by gender, we find something rather remarkable. Remember, 2,223 people aboard, and over 1,500 of them died. But there were only 412 women aboard. And of the 412 women, 108 died, meaning 74% of the women survived. And of course, women would do anything for their children, right? Well, that's not what the numbers seem to suggest, because 74% of the women survived, but half of the children died. And of the men, if we look at just the passengers, there were 1,300 male passengers, and 812 died, meaning only 37% of the passengers, the male passengers, survived, which is exactly one half as many as a percentage of as the women who died and survived. So ladies, you still want equality? Sure you do. But you also want to be the first off the damn boat, and you want to be covered up by your boyfriend when the shooter comes into the movie theater. And so I offer up into evidence the very powerful characteristic of female in-group preference as powerful evidence that a woman's soul was indeed created below. And next week, we will talk about how this female in-group preference affects the courts and the justice system by using two recent and very well-known court cases. For this week, I'm going to discuss the items on the Married Red Pill sidebar. One of the most common answers that people get when they ask a question on Married Red Pill is, dude, read the sidebar. And what I'm going to tell you over the next days and weeks is certainly not meant as a substitute for reading the sidebar. But I would like to give you a primer on the books that we discuss, and so I will devote the next few podcasts to discussing each of those books one by one. For today, I will give an overview of the entire sidebar, and then beginning next week, we will begin with No More Mr. Nice Guy by Robert Glover, and that, fellas, is the first book on the Married Red Pill sidebar. The book No More Mr. Nice Guy was a groundbreaking book that influenced much of the manosphere thought and the development of masculinity over the last decade or so. This is because the book No More Mr. Nice Guy had a couple of insights that are extremely important, and they provided a big part of Athol Kay's later work, the Mindful Attraction Plan and the Married Man's Sex Life Primer. These two books I just mentioned are the first two books in the required reading on the MRP sidebar. And there's a notation, Married Red Pill is advanced red pill on hard mode. Oh, is it ever? And you need to read the prerequisites before posting. Again, I'm not offering this audio as a substitute for reading the prerequisite, but I am suggesting if you listen to this podcast and listen to the next three podcasts, where I'm going to take the first three books on the required reading sidebar one by one, that you're probably in a fairly good position to begin posting. At least you have the basics of what the sidebar book talk about. But again, I can't emphasize it enough. This is no substitute for taking the time, sitting down, reading these books, and applying them to your life. Taking what you can from them and rejecting what you can't take from them. So the third book on the sidebar in the required reading, and the final book in the required reading, is When I Say No, I Feel Guilty by Smith. And then we have Red Pill 101. And the first and best book on Red Pill that was ever written is The Rational Male by Rollo Tomassi. He also has a sequel to that book that recently came out called Preventative Medicine. Then there is the Mindful Attraction Plan book by Ethel Kay, a short work called The 16 Commandments of Poon by the Herteist, and the Book of Pook, followed finally by the Red Pill Sidebar. At the graduate level, we have the books by David Dieta, and there's several of them. The one we have listed is The Way of the Superior Male. Then there's the Machiavellian book by Robert Greene, The 48 Laws of Power, and the truly graduate level book and the epic book that changes lives, The Sex God Method by Daniel Rose. So that's the overview. Let me take you through one at a time very quickly, and then as I say, next week we'll spend the entire podcast on No More Mr. Nice Guy. So let's start with that right now. No More Mr. Nice Guy is a short little book by a marriage and family therapist, and he identifies the, quote, nice guy, a nice guy who is validation and attention seeking and who relies on his relationship with women to form his perception of himself. Now, Robert Glover doesn't point this out, but the real problem is this is highly unattractive to women. So if you're relying on women for their validation, they will despise you. And so it turns out that nice guys are not really all that nice. He also identifies the concept of covert contracts, which is the idea you are doing something in order to get something in return, i.e., you are being, quote, nice, but you're only nice because you want to get laid. And Mr. Glover points out, Dr. Glover, that is not nice at all. To maintain a hidden covert contract in your mind. And we will talk about that more next week. The next book is Married Man Sex Life Primer by Ethel Kay. And this is a book that applies Robert Glover's book and the concept of the nice guy to a long-term marriage. And he merges this with some of the knowledge of pickup artists. And if you listen to my earlier podcasts, I've mentioned this book several times, in particular his chapter on wife seduction. But the Married Man Sex Life Primer takes you from beginning to end and spells out exactly what you need to do to regain the attraction in your wife. The final book in the required reading on the Married Red Pill Sidebar is the book When I Say No, I Feel Guilty. This is a long, tedious book that is quite painful and contains dozens, maybe hundreds of pages of transcripts of assertiveness seminar training. And that is essentially what this book is. It's an assertiveness seminar training book which explains to men how they can get rid of their covert contracts by being direct in their intentions. And also how you can argue with your wife without arguing. Because as President Putin said, it's better not to argue with women. I would add to that and say you're a fool if you argue with a woman. In part because of this female in-group preference. You can't win. They're going to favor the woman. Accept it, deal with it, and then learn from it and move on. So the book, When I Say No, I Feel Guilty, has a number of techniques to avoid arguing and at the same time to assert yourself strongly. And again, we'll talk about fogging and broken record and negative inquiries in another podcast. But basically, these are all techniques for avoiding conflict, and it's actually very effective. And this moves awful fast. I've only got a few minutes left, but we're at Red Pill 101. Again, we have the Rational Male book, and this should be required reading. Maybe not before you post, but good God, every man has to read this book, where Rollo explains the ways of men and women. Year 1, as I indicated, he's written a sequel to this book. And in this book, Rollo explains to us various concepts that are extremely important, such as hypergamy, the AFBB dynamic, that's alpha fucks and beta bucks, for those of you who don't know, along with female solipsism gained from his years of wisdom as a playa and as a moderator of the So Suave forums. The next book is The Mindful Attraction Plan by Ethel Kay, which was originally entitled The Man Action Plan, but he decided to appeal to a larger audience and changed the title. But in any event, it's the same acronym on Married Red Pill and on similar blogs. It's a good idea to have a man action plan in place. Where are you going? What's the route you're going to take? In short, what orders are you going to give as captain? And how are you going to improve yourself? There are a number of wonderful concepts in this book. The next item on the list is the 16 Commandments of Poon. This is not a book. It's about a 1,000-word essay on 16 rules that you must follow if you want to get laid. It is written completely for pickup artists, and it is completely 100% applicable to your marriage, which contains a bevy of good tips such as make her jealous, make your mission your priority, not your woman, and be irrationally self-confident. This really was a masterpiece written by Herteist back in 2008. The next book on the sidebar is the Book of Pook, and Pook is a genie. I love Pook. It's a conglomeration of posts by the enigmatic blogger Pook, who disappeared from the manosphere quite a few years ago. This, I believe, is the best introductory book to Red Pill and to the ways of women. If you read this, you will never forget the Fountain of Youth scene and the critical importance of that boyish, youthful charm in seduction. And nobody will get your head straighter on quicker than Pook. Pook is a genie who appears in a flash to a boy who's beginning his quest to find a girlfriend. And I won't ruin it for you, but Pook advises everything that we advise. Get in shape, connect with her emotions, don't dump negative things on her, and for God's sakes, don't talk about philosophy, politics, or sports. They don't care. And then finally we have, before we get to graduate level, we have listed the entire Red Pill sidebar. Remember, we're married Red Pill. The Red Pill sidebar contains a number of pieces, in particular the misandry bubble, which explains the true relations between the genders. And guys, trust me, it's not pretty. There's also some good stuff on seduction, excerpts from Rollo's book, The Rational Male, on the way men and women love differently, which is very controversial, and people scream and yell against it, but once you accept it, it makes things quite a bit easier. There's also Brifault's Law, Briffault. I encourage you to look it up. They had this figured out a long time ago. They just never bothered to tell us. And the Red Pill antibiotic nuke, which destroys feminism and the education of American and Western women. Once you've got all that done and you decide you want to go to the graduate level, we only have 3 books listed: The Way of the Superior Male, and David Dietta writes in a really flowery, feminine, positive way. I think sometimes he's almost worshiping the sacred feminine. But his works do achieve what the title in them suggests. For example, The Way of the Superior Male definitely comes through, and he tells you how to be a superior male. There's another book he wrote called The Way of the Superior Lover, and in that he tells you how to be a superior lover with a lot of tantric sex and stuff thrown in. The next book on the graduate level is The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene, and if you've been listening to my podcast, you know that I would put another book by Robert Greene, The Art of Seduction, in here as well. I should probably get to that at some point. But The 48 Laws of Power is truly a Machiavellian piece of work, which analyzes the way, or the 48 different pieces that people followed to achieve power, along with what happens when people transgressed this law of power, using actual historical examples. So it's a very fascinating book. I have the 48 Laws of Power engraved and framed over my desk. Some of the laws of power include: never outshine the master, conceal your intentions, always say less than necessary, and stir up waters to catch fish. And the last book we have as listed as a graduate level book is The Sex God Method by Daniel Rose. And unfortunately, this is only available for like $140 or so as part of this seminar he gives. But Daniel Rose really hit it out of the park with this book. It is absolutely amazing. And if you can get a hold of it by hook or by crook, I highly recommend that you do so, because the Sex God Method will absolutely change your freaking life. In it, he explains what it is that women really want that they would never tell you. And I'm actually a little reluctant to do this book because it is so controversial. But in my experience, and in the experience of a lot of guys who have read this book, once you start having sex with your wife, I call it like a caveman. And in fact, I have a good chunk of my next book already written, which is tentatively entitled The Joy of Caveman Sex. Everything changes. And this book gives you the guidelines on how to do that without ending up in prison. And as it turns out, it's not that hard because women like it. Remember in one of the early podcasts, we talked about the very potent desirability cue in women. Well, guess what, guys? This is how you activate it. So thank you very much for listening. Share this video with somebody who needs to hear it. Like, comment, and join the discussion over at Married Red Pill. And that music means my time is up. So as always, I leave you with the words and wisdom of Mr. Robert Plant and Led Zeppelin.
All your ears have turned away. But now's the time to look and look again at what you see. Is that the way it ought to stay?